World War II notes. The peace settlement that ended World War I was unsatisfactory to many nations, even some of the nations from the winning side. As a result, the peace of the 1920s was a troubled one, marked by instability within nations and between them. Unrest intensified in the 1930s as the Great Depression that began in the United States spread across the world. The hard times that followed, added to the tensions, caused some people to support dictators. A dictator is a ruler who has absolute power, who they promise order, prosperity, and a better future. Dictatorships developed in Germany, Italy, and the Soviet Union. In Italy, the leader was named Benito Mussolini. He overthrew their government in 1922. By the 1930s, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin had established a dictatorship, and he had created a totalitarian state. In the 1930s, a leader that most of you know, Adolf Hitler, had taken advantage of Germany's troubles to stir up German nationalism. Hitler brought Germany under complete Nazi control and established a totalitarian state. Like the Nazis in Japan, military leaders also sought to greatly expand their nation's territory. European leaders, Mussolini and Hitler, began to use military force to gain more territory. At first, Great Britain and France chose to avoid war by allowing Hitler to expand. On Hitler's order, German troops invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, and then 2 days later, Great Britain and France declared war on Germany, and that's how World War II began. Great Britain and France, they were known as the Allied powers, and in 1940, Germany, Italy, and Japan formed the Axis power. The United States remained neutral at this time. They decided to stay out of the war. However, President Roosevelt was able to persuade Congress to sell, lend, and lease war supplies to any country whose defense the president deemed vital to the defense of the United States. In 1941, this Lend-Lease Act was passed, and the United States gave about $50 billion in war supplies to more than 40 allied nations. However, on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, Japanese planes roared out of the clouds, raining bombs down on our naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. In a little more than 2 hours, the Japanese had sunk or damaged all 8 of our battleships in the U.S. Pacific Fleet. The attack destroyed or damaged 347 aircraft, and more than 2,400 Americans were killed. So on the next day, President Roosevelt spoke to a shocked nation, and he said, December 7th, 1941 is a date which will live in infamy. Despite its isolationism approach, the United States, the next day, December 8th, Congress declared war on Japan. And so America had entered World War II. Great Britain and France had been fighting in Germany since 1939, and in 1940, Italy entered the war on the side of Germany and the Axis powers. France surrendered to Germany in 1940. Great Britain fought on a loan led by Prime Minister Winston Churchill. In the Battle of Britain, the Royal Air Force successfully defended Britain from bombing raids that were launched by German planes over a 3-month period of time in the summer and fall of 1940. For 3 months, nightly bombs were dropped on Great Britain. but the Royal Air Force was able to hold off. By the time the United States entered the war, the Axis powers controlled most of Europe. The United States began their campaign in North Africa, where the German defenses were weaker. From North Africa, the Allies crossed the Mediterranean Sea to attack Italy. Meanwhile, beginning in June of 1941, Hitler had launched an invasion of the Soviet Union. As the brutal Russian winter set in, the German army attacking the city was surrounded by Soviet troops, and Germany was forced to give up that battle. The bloody defense of Stalingrad cost the Soviets more than 1 million soldiers and civilians, more than all of the American casualties in the entire war. However, that victory marked a turning point. After Stalingrad, the Russian army stopped retreating and began to advance on Germany. The Soviet struggle on the Eastern Front played a huge role in defeating Germany. While the Soviet Union prepared to invade Germany, from the east, the Allies readied an invasion of France on the west. They gave the mission the code name Operation Overlord, or D-Day. It was on June 6th, 1944. Earlier in that morning, about 176,000 troops, 4,000 landing craft, and 600 warships, and almost 14,000 planes left England for the beaches of Normandy. It was on a coast that Germany occupied off of France. The D-Day invasion was the largest combined land, sea, air operation in history. Within 2 weeks, the Allies landed 1 million soldiers in France and began to move inland. By 1945, the Allies were closing in on Germany. While marching across Poland towards the German capital of Berlin, Soviet troops came upon a German concentration camp. There they found thousands of people that were so weak and sick, and they seemed like corpses. They also found a huge crematorium, which is a furnace for burning dead bodies. One of the correspondents that was there said it is not a concentration camp. It was a gigantic murdering plant, which unfortunately was true. Long before invading Poland, Hitler and his followers had persecuted Jews and other groups, including gypsies and Poles and homosexuals. They viewed those groups as inferior to German master race. It was an Aryan nation, as he called it. When German troops invaded Soviet Union, they formed mobile killing squads, and they executed over 1 million Jews as the army advanced into Soviet territory. Germany then turned to more industrial methods of killing. When the German troops went, they rounded up Jews and other groups that they considered inferior. They put them in prison camps. They were forced to work as slaves. The rest were murdered soon after they arrived. The massive program of systematic murder is actually called Holocaust. Across Europe, the Nazis murdered an estimated 6 million Jews. By April 30th, 1945, Hitler knew that they had lost the war. So rather than surrender, he committed suicide in his Berlin headquarters. And a week later, Germany surrendered to the Allies. Throughout the Allied countries, people celebrated VE Day, which is Victory in Europe Day. Only after defeating Germany did the Allies discover the full extent of what the Holocaust of these millions of Jews and what had happened. The war in the Pacific, by the end of the Battle of Midway, Japan had lost 4 aircraft carriers and 322 planes. Never again would Japan be able to threaten the United States. The United States was going to take on Japan. The tide of the battle in the Pacific had turned. After Midway, the Allies began the task of driving the Japanese off hundreds of islands that are scattered over thousands of miles of ocean in the Pacific. Rather than attack every Japanese stronghold, the Allies adapted a new strategy known as island hopping. Using that strategy, the Allied troops would seize islands that were less well defended, and then they used these islands as bases from which to attack Japanese ships that were supplying the bigger islands, and virtually it would starve them. It would starve them out. While island hopping worked, few islands gave up easily. The Japanese soldiers viewed surrender as deeply shameful, and they would have fierce resistance to giving up. After the month-long Battle of Iwo Jima, it was one of the bloodiest battles of the war. Nearly 22,000 Japanese troops fought to their death, and more than 6,800 American troops died. The Battle of Okinawa continued for 3 months, and it claimed the lives of 12,000 American and more than 100,000 Japanese soldiers. Japanese pilots would fly their planes over and run them into the American ships. They were known as kamikaze pilots because they would go to their death. President Roosevelt did not live to see the hard-won victory in Okinawa because on April 12, 1945, he died from a stroke. So Vice President Harry S. Truman took over and became our new president. A few days later, Truman was handed a memo that began, within 4 months, we shall, in all probability, have completed the most terrible weapon ever known in human history. It was the first that Truman had ever heard of the Manhattan Project, which was the atomic bomb project. It was a top secret U.S. government program that was established to build an atomic weapon. On August 6th, 1945, an American plane named the Enola Gay dropped that first atomic bomb on a Japanese city of Hiroshima. A blinding flash filled the sky, an explosion that killed over 70,000 people almost instantly. And then Japan, although stunned, didn't surrender. So 3 days later, a second atomic bomb was exploded on the city of Nagasaki. It killed an estimated 40,000 people. Japanese Emperor Hirohito actually said, "I cannot bear to see my innocent people suffer any longer," and he announced Japan's surrender. As many as 250,000 Japanese have died because of the 2 atomic bombs, either directly or because of burns, radiation poisoning, cancers, etc. On August 15th, 1945, Americans celebrated VJ Day, which is Victory in Japan Day, which ended the war. The aftermath of the war, the Allied powers occupied Germany and Japan after the war, and they disbanded their militaries. As many as 60 million people died in World War II. About half of them were civilians or people that weren't serving in the military. The Soviet Union suffered the highest losses. Germany and Japan had to disarm and give up all military and all territory that they had taken. There were some trials set up, the Nuremberg trials. The Allies charged 22 Nazi leaders with war crimes. 12 defendants were condemned to death by hanging, 7 received prison terms, and 3 were acquitted in these Nuremberg trials. Similar trials were held in Japan, and U.S. officials drafted a new constitution for the Japanese country. 28 Japanese were tried, and all were found guilty. 16 received life sentences. 7 were sentenced to death by hanging, including Japanese Prime Minister Tojo. American servicemen, millions Americans served in the armed forces. More than 5 million people volunteered for military during World War II, and another 10 million were drafted. The military was, they mixed the Americans together as they had never before. More than 292,000 Americans died in World War II battles. Those that survived were proud of their military service. The government created new agencies to manage the production of war materials and to control the flow of war information. Just a month after the attack on Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt set up the War Production Board, which forced American factories into making machines for war supplies and equipment. It banned any non-essential goods. Automakers began making tanks and jeeps and trucks. Shirt makers began making mosquito netting to protect the soldiers from disease-carrying mosquitoes. Americans at home aided the war by producing weapons, planes, ships, tanks, and other vehicles. Within 2 years of Pearl Harbor, U.S. factories were producing more military equipment than all of the Axis countries combined. Huge amounts of money were needed, so the government borrowed from banks and businesses and individuals. Americans bought war bonds to help out with the war effort. To keep spirits high, the government established an Office of War Information, where they provided upbeat stories and photographs to the newspapers, the magazines, and the radio stations. As factories and farms focused on military needs, consumers were hit by major shortages of almost everything. American consumers contributed to the war effort by creatively rationing and taking care of planting victory gardens and pocketless pants. 6 million women replaced men in vital occupations and served in non-combat roles. No matter how well they worked, though, they were paid about 60% as much as the men doing the same jobs, and it turned out that most of them were fired once the men came back from war. For Japanese Americans on the West Coast, it was a painful time. They were put in internment camps because they were seen as possibly taking the side of Japan and being spies. Despite that injustice, many Japanese Americans volunteered for military service. And in 1988, Congress passed legislation that gave $20,000 to every Japanese American who had been interned or confined in the camps. And with each check came a written apology from President George H.W. Bush for the serious injustices that were done to Japanese Americans during World War II. For African Americans and Mexican Americans, They coped with prejudice even though they contributed to the war effort. While they were fighting dictatorships overseas as well as discrimination at home, almost 90,000 African Americans served in the military during the war. African Americans began to serve in every kind of combat position, from fighter pilots to tank operators to sailors. But as factories geared up for war production, many would not even hire African Americans. President Roosevelt responded to that by issuing an order calling on employers and labor unions to end discrimination because of race, creed, color, or national origin in defense industries. By 1944, some 2 million African Americans were working in defense plants across the nation. Unlike African Americans, Mexican Americans did not fight in segregated units, but they still faced prejudice. To help American farmers grow more food, the United States began the Bracero program, where they brought in large numbers of Mexican farm workers who harvested crops. Many Mexican Americans also moved to cities to take jobs in the defense industries. Jewish Americans witnessed how anti-Semitism and a fear of refugees kept the United States from responding sooner to the plight of the European Jews. Despite the persecution of Jews in Europe, the U.S. government refused to relax its strict immigration limits. Widespread anti-Semitism played a big part in this decision. In addition, many Americans worried that accepting more refugees would mean added competition for their jobs, the jobs that were already scarce due to the Great Depression. Many Jewish Americans protested the government's reluctance to help the Jewish refugees. And in 1943, when Americans began to hear stories about German death camps, more than 400 Jewish rabbis marched in Washington, D.C. To urge the Allies to rescue Europe's Jews from the Nazi extermination. In 1944, President Roosevelt finally created the War Refugee Board. In just a few months, the board rescued 200,000 Jews from the Nazis. But the effort came a little bit too late to help the vast majority of Europe's Jews. Albert Einstein was one of the 100,000 Jewish refugees from Nazis' persecution that was allowed to enter the United States. And he was a brilliant nuclear physicist that urged President Roosevelt to begin developing the atomic bomb before the Nazis succeeded in building one. And that's notes for World War II.